You need to leave. Now. This cabin is ours for the month, and we don't need you here ruining everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The words sliced through the mountain air like a blade. I stood in the doorway of my own cabin, my hiking boots still muddy from the trail, staring at my older sister Rebecca as she blocked my entrance with crossed arms and an expression of pure contempt. Behind her, I could see at least a dozen people scattered throughout the great room of the property I had spent 3 years renovating with my own hands. Strangers were drinking from my handmade ceramic mugs, their feet propped on my custom woodwork coffee table, their luggage piled in corners like they were settling in for an extended stay. My name is Diana Castellano, and I am 34 years old. For the past 11 years, I have worked as a wilderness conservation officer for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, a career that has taken me deep into the backcountry of the Rocky Mountains and given me a profound appreciation for the delicate balance between human presence and natural preservation. The cabin where my sister was currently denying me entry was not some family heirloom or shared property. It was mine, purchased with money I had saved meticulously over 7 years, bought at auction when the previous owner defaulted on their mortgage, and restored from near ruin through countless weekends of labor that left my hands blistered and my back aching. The property sat at an elevation of 9,000 feet in the San Juan Mountains, accessible only by a winding Forest Service road that became impassable in winter and challenging even in summer. It was a 2-bedroom structure built in the 1970s, originally constructed as a hunting lodge, but abandoned for nearly a decade before I acquired it. When I first saw the place, the roof leaked in 4 places, the plumbing was frozen and cracked, the windows were broken, and wildlife had made themselves comfortable in what remained of the interior. Most people would have seen an unsalvageable wreck. I saw potential. I had spent every spare moment over 3 years transforming that wreck into something extraordinary. I replaced the entire roof myself, learning the trade through online tutorials and help from a retired carpenter I befriended at the hardware store. I ripped out all the old plumbing and installed new lines that could withstand the extreme temperature fluctuations of mountain living. I replaced every window with energy-efficient double panes that could handle winter storms. I sanded and refinished the original hardwood floors, revealing beautiful timber that had been hidden under decades of grime. I built custom shelving, installed a wood-burning stove that could heat the entire structure, and created a deck that overlooked a pristine alpine meadow where elk grazed at dawn. The cabin was my sanctuary, my achievement, my proof that I could build something meaningful with my own determination and skill. It represented everything I valued about self-reliance, hard work, and connection to the natural world. And now my sister, who had visited exactly twice during the entire renovation process and offered nothing more than criticism about how remote it was and how much easier it would have been to just buy a condo in Denver, was standing in my doorway telling me to leave. "Rebecca," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "This is my cabin. I own it. I told you 2 weeks ago that I was coming up here this weekend to do trail maintenance work in the area." My sister's expression did not change. She was 3 years older than me, married for 8 years to a man named Todd who worked in commercial real estate, and she had always carried herself with an air of superiority that our parents had never challenged. Where I had chosen a career in public service that paid modestly but aligned with my values, Rebecca had pursued status and appearance above all else. She lived in a sprawling house in an expensive suburb of Denver, drove a luxury SUV she could barely afford, and seemed to measure her worth by how her life appeared on social media, rather than by any genuine accomplishment or connection. "I don't care what you told me," Rebecca said, her voice sharp. "Todd's entire family is here for a reunion. His parents drove all the way from Arizona. His brother flew in from Seattle with his kids. We have 15 people who need this space and you're just one person. Do the math, Diana. Your little wilderness princess routine can wait another week." I blinked, trying to process the audacity of what I was hearing. "How did you even get in? I never gave you a key." She had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable for a fraction of a second before her expression hardened again. "I made a copy last time I was here. You left your keys on the counter when you were showing me the deck repairs. I figured it made sense for family to have access for emergencies." The violation of that admission hit me like a physical blow. She had stolen my key, made an unauthorized copy, and then used it to invade my property without permission or even notification. And she was framing this theft and trespass as reasonable family behavior. That's not an emergency, Rebecca. That's theft and breaking and entering. I moved to step past her into my own cabin, but she shifted to continue blocking the doorway. Don't be dramatic. We're family. Family shares things. You've always been so selfish about this place. Acting like it's some sacred temple instead of just a cabin in the woods. Well, guess what? Todd's family needed somewhere to stay, and I wasn't going to let them pay for some overpriced resort when you have all this space sitting empty most of the time. A man appeared behind Rebecca, tall and broad-shouldered with thinning hair and an expensive polo shirt. Todd. He placed his hand on my sister's shoulder in a gesture that was clearly meant to be supportive but came across as possessive. Is there a problem here? He asked, looking at me as if I were a solicitor who had appeared at an inconvenient time. Yes, there's a problem, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. Your wife broke into my property without permission and invited your entire family to stay here without asking me. That's called trespassing. Todd's expression shifted to something between annoyance and dismissal. Oh, come on. Rebecca explained the situation. We have 15 people who need a place to stay for our family reunion. You're one person. Surely you can be flexible for a few days. It's not like you're using the place right now anyway. I'm literally standing here with my gear because I plan to use it this weekend. And even if I weren't, that doesn't give you the right to occupy my property. An older woman emerged from deeper in the cabin, her silver hair perfectly styled and her clothing expensive in that understated way that signals real money. Todd's mother, I presumed. She surveyed me with the same expression of mild irritation one might direct at a barking dog. Rebecca dear, who is this? She asked, as if I were not standing right there capable of introducing myself. This is my younger sister Diana, Rebecca said, her tone making it clear she was already framing me as the unreasonable party. She owns the cabin, but she's being difficult about us using it for the weekend. Difficult? I repeated, my voice sharp with disbelief. I'm being difficult about strangers occupying my property without my consent? Todd's mother gave me a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. Well, I certainly hope this can be resolved without unpleasantness. We've driven a very long way, and everyone is quite settled in. Perhaps you could stay with your parents for a few days? I'm sure they would be happy to have you. The presumption of it, the casual dismissal of my rights and plans, the expectation that I should simply accommodate their convenience at the cost of my own autonomy, was staggering. I looked past them into my cabin and could see Todd's family members moving about with complete comfort, as if they had every right to be there. Children were running through the space I had carefully crafted. Someone had moved my furniture to make room for an inflatable mattress. I could see food and supplies spread across my kitchen counter, and through the window I spotted several vehicles parked haphazardly on the meadow grass. I had specifically asked people never to drive on because it damaged the fragile alpine ecosystem. No, I said quietly, but with absolute certainty. No, I'm not going anywhere. This is my property. You all need to leave. Rebecca's face flushed with anger. Are you seriously going to do this? Are you really going to kick out 15 people, including elderly grandparents and small children, because you're too selfish to share for one weekend? I'm going to enforce my property rights, yes. You had no right to bring these people here. You stole my key and invaded my home. The fact that you brought children and grandparents along doesn't change the fundamental fact that you are trespassing. Todd stepped forward, his posture aggressive. Listen, I don't know what your problem is, but you need to get some perspective here. We're talking about one weekend. One weekend of minor inconvenience for you versus ruining an entire family reunion that we've been planning for months. Be reasonable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I am being reasonable. You're the ones who made plans involving property you don't own without asking permission. That's not my problem to solve. A younger woman, probably Todd's sister-in-law, appeared with a toddler on her hip. What's going on? Is everything okay? Everything's fine, Rebecca said quickly. My sister is just having some issues with sharing, but we're working it out. We're not working anything out, I corrected firmly. I'm asking you all to leave my property. Now. The situation was drawing more attention. More of Todd's family members were gathering, creating an audience for this confrontation. I could feel their eyes on me, see their expressions ranging from confusion to irritation to outright hostility. In their narrative, carefully crafted by Rebecca and Todd, I was the villain interrupting a wholesome family gathering. They had no context for the theft, the violation, the complete disregard for boundaries that had brought them here. Todd's father, a heavy-set man with a red face that suggested either high blood pressure or recent sun exposure, joined the growing crowd in the doorway. What's all this commotion? We're trying to get the barbecue started. This is Diana, my sister, Rebecca explained with exaggerated patience, as if speaking to a child. She's upset that we're using her cabin for the reunion. Using without permission, I interjected. Breaking and entering. Trespassing. Todd's father waved his hand dismissively. Oh, for heaven's sake. It's family. Family doesn't trespass. You young people and your obsession with boundaries and personal space. Back in my day, we understood that family meant sharing and sacrifice. Back in your day, did family mean stealing keys and invading people's homes without asking? I shot back. His expression darkened. Watch your tone, young lady. I don't know how you were raised, but in our family we show respect to our elders. And in my value system, I show respect to people who respect my property rights, regardless of their age. The situation was escalating rapidly. More family members were emerging from various parts of the cabin, drawn by the raised voices. I counted at least 14 people, possibly more, all looking at me with varying degrees of hostility or confusion. I was outnumbered on my own property, being made to feel like an intruder by people who had literally broken into my home. Rebecca pulled out her phone, and I saw her typing rapidly. I'm texting Mom and Dad. They need to know how you're behaving. Please do, I said. Make sure to mention the part where you stole my key and broke into my cabin without permission. I didn't break in. I used a key. And I'm family, so it's not stealing, it's borrowing. You can't borrow something without asking. That's literally the definition of stealing. A teenage boy, probably one of Todd's nephews, laughed at my comment. She's got you there, Aunt Rebecca. Rebecca whirled on him. Not helping, Tyler. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a text from my mother that simply read, "What is going on? Rebecca says you're causing a scene at the cabin." I typed back quickly. Rebecca broke into my cabin without permission and brought Todd's entire family here for the weekend. I came up from my planned trip and found them occupying my property. I've asked them to leave and they're refusing. The response came almost immediately. Can't you just let them have the weekend? It's family. Don't make this a bigger issue than it needs to be. I stared at the message, feeling something crack inside me. Even my mother, without hearing my side or asking for details, had immediately taken Rebecca's position. It was a pattern I had seen play out my entire life. Rebecca was the golden child, the one who had followed a conventional path, married well, produced grandchildren. I was the one who had chosen a career in the wilderness, who had remained single by choice, who had prioritized experiences over possessions and authenticity over appearances. And time and again, when conflicts arose, my parents sided with Rebecca because maintaining peace in the family meant prioritizing whoever would cause the most drama if their desires were not met. No, I texted back. I will not just let them have the weekend. This is my property, purchased with my money, and I did not give permission for any of this. I looked up from my phone to find Rebecca watching me with a smug expression. Did Mom tell you to stop being selfish? Mom told me what she always tells me, which is to accommodate you because you're incapable of accepting consequences for your actions. But I'm done with that pattern, Rebecca. I'm done being the reasonable one who has to sacrifice because you refuse to respect boundaries. Todd stepped forward again, his jaw tight. All right, that's enough. You need to leave. You're upsetting people, especially the kids. We're not going anywhere. We have just as much right to be here as you do. You have zero right to be here. This is private property. My private property. Rebecca is family, and family has implied permission to use family property. There is no such thing as implied permission when explicit permission was never granted. And even if there were, that permission doesn't extend to random in-laws and their extended family. Todd's face was turning red now. Random in-laws? That's my family you're talking about. These are good people who drove hours to be here. And you're treating them like criminals. They're criminals adjacent at minimum. They're occupying property they were brought to through an act of theft. Whether they knew it or not doesn't change the fact that they need to leave. An older woman I hadn't seen before, presumably Todd's grandmother based on her age, spoke up from where she sat on my couch. In all my years, I have never been spoken to with such disrespect. Young woman, you should be ashamed of yourself. I'm not the one who needs to feel shame right now, ma'am. I'm the property owner asking trespassers to leave. Rebecca's eyes were blazing now. You know what, Diana? You've always been like this. Always so rigid, so unbending, so incapable of just going with the flow. Everything has to be exactly your way, on your terms, according to your precious principles. Well, guess what? The rest of us have learned how to be flexible, how to compromise, how to put family first. Putting family first doesn't mean letting family walk all over you, Rebecca. It doesn't mean accepting theft and trespass just because the thief shares your DNA. You've confused being family with having unlimited license to violate boundaries, and I'm not playing that game anymore. This is unbelievable, Todd said, pulling out his own phone. I'm calling our lawyer. You can't just kick people out with no notice, especially when your own family member gave us permission to be here. Your family member had no authority to give you permission. She doesn't own this property. And actually, I can absolutely require trespassers to leave immediately. That's how property rights work. A little girl, probably about 6 years old, started crying. Mommy, why is that lady yelling? Her mother, one of Todd's relatives, scooped her up and glared at me. Now look what you've done. You're scaring children. I'm not scaring anyone. I'm asking people who broke into my home to leave. If the situation is scary, blame the adults who created it, not the person trying to resolve it. My phone rang. My father. I answered, knowing this conversation was inevitable. Diana Marie Castellano, what on earth is going on? His voice was stern, using my full name the way he had when I was a child being scolded for tracking mud through the house. Rebecca stole my cabin key, made a copy without permission, and brought Todd's entire extended family here for a reunion without asking me. I arrived for my planned weekend and found my property occupied by strangers. I've asked them to leave and they're refusing. That's what's going on, Dad. Rebecca says you're being completely unreasonable. She says she asked if she could use the cabin and you said it was fine. That's a lie. She never asked. Check my text history with her. I mentioned 2 weeks ago that I was coming up this weekend to do trail work. She acknowledged the message. She knew I would be here. Silence on the other end. Then more quietly, Diana, even if there was a miscommunication, can't you just work something out? These people have driven a long way. They have small children and elderly parents. Surely you can find it in your heart to be flexible. Why is flexibility always something I'm required to provide? Why doesn't Rebecca need to be flexible? Why doesn't she need to respect my property and my plans? Because you're capable of it and Rebecca is more. She needs more support. You've always been the strong one, the independent one. We know you can handle disappointment better than your sister can. And there it was, the fundamental inequity that had defined our relationship for decades. Because I was competent and self-reliant, I was expected to absorb the consequences of Rebecca's incompetence and selfishness. Because I didn't make demands or create drama, my needs were perpetually subordinated to those of people who did. The reward for being strong was to have that strength exploited indefinitely. No, Dad. I'm not doing this anymore. Rebecca needs to face consequences for her actions. She stole from me, violated my property, and then lied about it. I'm not rewarding that behavior by sacrificing my weekend. Diana, please. Think about your mother. This kind of family conflict upsets her terribly. She's already anxious about all of this. Do you really want to be responsible for affecting her health? The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. My mother's anxiety was real, but it was also wielded as a weapon to control my behavior, to ensure I never enforced boundaries because doing so might upset the family equilibrium that depended on my continued acquiescence. I'm not responsible for Mom's anxiety, Dad. I'm responsible for my own boundaries and my own property. If she's anxious, maybe she should direct that anxiety toward Rebecca, who created this entire situation through theft and deception. You're being very cold right now, Diana. This isn't like you. No, Dad, this is exactly like me. This is me finally acting in accordance with my values instead of suppressing them to keep everyone else comfortable. If that seems cold to you, maybe you should examine why you think respecting myself is a character flaw. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. When I looked up, the entire crowd of Todd's family was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to anger to something that might have been respect from Tyler, the teenager who had laughed earlier. All right, I said, my voice steady and clear. I'm going to make this very simple. You have 30 minutes to pack your belongings and vacate this property. If you're not gone by then, I will drive to the ranger station and file a formal trespass complaint with the sheriff's office. Given that this property is in my name alone, that I have documentation of ownership, and that none of you were given permission to be here, they will remove you. It will be embarrassing, it will be unpleasant, and it will create exactly the kind of scene you're accusing me of making. Or you can leave now with dignity intact. Your choice. Rebecca laughed, but it sounded forced. You're bluffing. You wouldn't actually call the police on your own family. Try me, Rebecca. I have spent 3 years building this place with my own hands and my own money. I will absolutely defend it against people who think being related to me gives them the right to steal from me. You have 29 minutes now. I turned and walked back to my truck, pulling out my camping chair and setting it up in a position where I could watch the cabin's front door. Then I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything with photographs and video. The vehicles parked on the meadow grass, the crowd of people in my doorway, the timestamp showing this was happening during the weekend I had specifically said I would be here. The next 28 minutes would reveal whether words alone would be sufficient or whether I would need to follow through on my ultimatum. Either way, I was done being the family doormat. Something had shifted inside me during that confrontation. Something fundamental and irreversible. I had spent my entire adult life building something meaningful, and I would not allow it to be taken from me by people who valued convenience over respect, even if those people were family. Especially if those people were family, because the betrayal cut deeper when it came from those who were supposed to have your back. I sat in my camping chair watching my cabin, watching the people inside debate and argue and presumably pack, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in this moment. I felt free. Free from the obligation to absorb disrespect in the name of family harmony. Free from the expectation that my needs were always negotiable while others' wants were sacrosanct. Free from the role I had been assigned since childhood of being the reasonable one, the flexible one, the one who could be counted on to sacrifice without complaint. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her face flushed and her expression furious. You're really going to do this? You're really going to choose a stupid cabin over your own family? No, Rebecca, I called back. I'm choosing self-respect. You're the one who chose a free vacation over respecting your sister. Don't project your values onto me. She disappeared back inside, and I could hear raised voices though I couldn't make out the words. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was the time of day I loved most in the mountains, when the light turned golden and the shadows grew long and the world seemed to hold its breath between day and night. I had come here to experience this, to spend my weekend hiking the trails I was responsible for maintaining, to sleep in the space I had created, to exist in alignment with the life I had built for myself. And I would have exactly that, even if I had to call in law enforcement to make it happen. The clock on my phone showed 3 minutes remaining in the 30-minute deadline I had imposed. I pulled up the non-emergency number for the county sheriff and held my finger over the call button, waiting to see if I would need to use it. The 30 minutes elapsed with excruciating slowness. I sat in my camping chair watching the front door of my cabin as the golden hour light deepened into the rich amber that precedes twilight in the high country. Through the windows I could see movement and shadows, the frantic activity of people who had finally realized that their comfortable occupation was coming to an end. Bags appeared on the deck, then more bags, then children carrying stuffed animals and adults hauling coolers. The exodus had begun. Todd emerged first, his face set in hard lines of anger. He loaded items into a large SUV without looking in my direction, his movements sharp and aggressive. His mother followed, her expression one of profound offense, as if she had been personally insulted by the universe itself. One by one, the family members who had been so comfortably settled in my space just an hour earlier filed out, loading their vehicles with the supplies and luggage they had unpacked with such confidence. Rebecca was the last to appear. She stood on the deck holding a duffel bag, staring at me across the clearing with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. It was not quite anger, not quite hurt, but something closer to disbelief. She seemed genuinely shocked that I had held firm, that I had not crumbled under the pressure of family obligation and social expectation. In her worldview, I was the accommodating sister, the one who could be counted on to bend. The fact that I had refused to bend this time appeared to have shaken something fundamental in her understanding of our relationship. "You've changed," she called across the distance separating us. Her voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "You used to be kind. You used to care about family." "I still care about family," I replied, my voice equally clear. "I just no longer believe that caring about family means accepting disrespect. Those are not the same thing, Rebecca." She shook her head, climbed into Todd's SUV, and within 10 minutes the convoy of vehicles had disappeared down the Forest Service road, leaving only tire tracks in the meadow grass as evidence they had ever been there. I sat in my chair for several minutes after they left, listening to the silence return to the mountains. An elk bugled in the distance, the haunting call echoing across the valley. The wind moved through the aspen trees that bordered the clearing, creating the distinctive rustling sound that locals called the quaking, that gave the species its name. The natural world continued its rhythms, completely indifferent to the human drama that had just unfolded. Finally I stood, shouldered my pack and walked into my cabin. The interior looked like a tornado had passed through. Furniture had been rearranged, trash bags full of garbage sat in corners. The kitchen was a disaster of dirty dishes and food remnants, and my carefully organized storage closets had been rifled through and left in disarray. The air smelled of unfamiliar bodies and cooking oil, and the particular staleness that comes from too many people occupying too small a space for too long. My sanctuary had been violated, marked by strangers who had treated it as a temporary convenience, rather than the home I had created through years of effort. I spent the next 3 hours cleaning. I washed dishes, wiped counters, swept floors, took out garbage, and returned furniture to its proper position. I opened all the windows despite the cooling evening air because I needed to clear out the foreign smells and reclaim the space as mine. As I worked, I thought about how I had arrived at this moment, about the long history that had made this confrontation inevitable. Rebecca and I had been close as children, or at least I had thought we were close. She was the older sister I admired and tried to emulate, even though we were fundamentally different people. Rebecca had always been social, popular, concerned with fitting in and being liked. She had navigated school's social hierarchies with an intuitive skill I never possessed, always knowing the right thing to say, and the right way to present herself to maximize approval. I had been the odd one, more interested in the biology textbooks than in gossip, more comfortable hiking alone in the foothills behind our house than attending parties. Our parents had loved us both, but their love manifested differently. Rebecca received constant attention and engagement, endless conversations about her social life and her feelings and her experiences. I received benign neglect punctuated by occasional concern that I was too isolated, too focused on my studies, too comfortable with solitude. They worried about me in the abstract but seemed relieved that I did not require the constant emotional management that Rebecca demanded. Over time, this dynamic created a family system in which Rebecca's needs were centered and my needs were assumed to be minimal, because I did not vocalize them as loudly or as frequently. When Rebecca struggled financially after her wedding because she and Todd had spent beyond their means on the ceremony and honeymoon, I loaned her $8,000 that was never repaid and never mentioned again. When I bought the cabin and needed help with the initial cleanup and basic repairs, I received expressions of concern that I was taking on too much and vague promises to visit that never materialized. The inequity had built slowly over decades, each individual instance small enough to overlook, but the cumulative effect was profound. I had become the family member who existed to provide support but who was not entitled to receive it in return. My strength and independence, qualities that should have been celebrated, had instead been weaponized against me. Because I could take care of myself, the reasoning went, I did not need anyone else to take care of me. Therefore all the family resources of time, attention, money, and emotional energy could be directed toward Rebecca, who demonstrated through her constant needs that she required such resources. I had enabled this pattern through my own behavior. Every time I loaned money that was not repaid, every time I provided help that was not reciprocated, every time I accepted explanations and excuses for behavior that would not have been tolerated from me, I had reinforced the idea that my boundaries were permeable and my needs were optional. I had taught people how to treat me, and I had taught them poorly. The cabin represented something different. It was mine in a way that nothing else in my life had ever been mine. I had not inherited it or received it as a gift or acquired it through any relationship. I had earned the money to buy it through my own work. I had transformed it through my own labor. Every board I had replaced, every wall I had painted, every system I had repaired carried the mark of my effort and my vision. It was tangible proof that I was capable of creating something valuable and beautiful through my own determination. When Rebecca had asked for a key during her second visit to the cabin, I had hesitated. Some instinct had warned me that giving her access was a mistake, that it would lead to complications I could not foresee. But the voice of conditioning had been stronger than the voice of instinct. Family shares things. Family trusts each other. Family does not treat each other like potential threats. So I had given her a key and told myself I was being paranoid to feel uncomfortable about it. The fact that she had then copied the key without permission and used that unauthorized copy to facilitate today's invasion proved that my instincts had been correct all along. Rebecca did not view the cabin as my property to be respected. She viewed it as a family resource to be utilized for her benefit. The work I had put into it, the money I had spent on it, the love I had poured into every detail, none of that mattered in her calculation. What mattered was that it existed and she wanted to use it, and in her worldview those two facts were sufficient to justify her actions. By midnight I had restored the cabin to an approximation of its normal state. The major cleaning was done, though I would need to do a more thorough job in the morning. I made myself dinner, reheating soup I had prepared and frozen during my last visit, and ate it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the meadow where the moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and shadow. My body was tired from the drive, the confrontation, and the cleaning, but my mind was racing with everything that had happened and everything that would follow. My phone had been buzzing periodically throughout the evening. Text messages from my parents, from Rebecca, from numbers I did not recognize who I assumed were members of Todd's family, who had somehow obtained my contact information. I had ignored them all while I cleaned, needing to focus on the physical task of reclaiming my space before I could deal with the emotional task of managing other people's reactions to my boundaries. Now, with the cabin clean and my dinner finished, I finally looked at what had accumulated. My mother had sent 6 messages, each one more anxious than the last. The first asked me to reconsider my position. The second informed me that Rebecca was very upset. The third suggested I might need to talk to someone about my anger issues. The fourth mentioned that family gatherings would be difficult if I insisted on making everything so contentious. The fifth stated that she had always tried to treat both her daughters equally, and did not understand where she had gone wrong with me. The sixth was simply a sad face emoji, which somehow felt more manipulative than all the words that had preceded it. My father had sent 2 messages. The first said that he was disappointed in me. The second said that he hoped I was satisfied with myself now that I had ruined a family event and caused my mother distress. The accusatory tone was familiar. Throughout my childhood, whenever I had attempted to advocate for myself or point out unfair treatment, the response had been that I was causing problems rather than identifying problems that already existed. Rebecca had sent a lengthy message that alternated between self-pity and attack. She wrote that she could not believe I would treat her this way after everything she had done for me over the years. She listed a series of supposed favors and kindnesses, most of which I either did not remember or remembered very differently. She claimed that she had always been there for me, conveniently omitting the countless times I had been there for her while she had been absent during my difficulties. She concluded by saying that Todd's parents thought I was mentally unstable, and that maybe they were right. The messages from unknown numbers were variations on a theme. I was selfish. I was cruel. I had ruined a special event for children and elderly people. I clearly had issues with family and intimacy. I should seek professional help. I owed Rebecca and Todd an apology. One message, from someone who identified herself as Todd's sister, Went so far as to say that she would be posting about my behavior on social media so that everyone would know what kind of person I really was. I read through all of it once, taking in the collective message that everyone involved had decided I was the villain in this situation. Not one person had acknowledged that Rebecca had stolen from me. Not one person had recognized that I had been the victim of trespass. Not one person had suggested that maybe, just maybe, I had a legitimate grievance and a right to defend my property. The entire family system had mobilized to pressure me back into compliance with the role I was supposed to play. I deleted every message without responding. There was nothing I could say that would change anyone's mind, and I was not interested in defending myself to people who had already decided I was wrong. The facts were simple and clear. Rebecca had taken my key without permission, made an unauthorized copy, and used it to facilitate an invasion of my property. I had asked the trespassers to leave and they had left. Everything I had done was legally and ethically justified. If people wanted to construct a narrative in which I was the bad actor, that revealed their values and priorities, not mine. I made up my bed with the sheets I kept stored in the upstairs linen closet. The good ones I reserved for my own use because I liked the way they felt against my skin after a long day in the mountains. I fell asleep to the sound of wind in the aspens and the distant yipping of coyotes marking their territory in the valley below, confident that I had done the right thing even though it had come at considerable cost. The next morning I woke before dawn, made coffee, and watched the sun rise over the eastern peaks from my deck. The light came slowly at first, a gradual brightening of the sky that shifted from black to deep blue to pale gold. Then the sun itself appeared. A sliver of brilliance that expanded rapidly until the entire valley was flooded with morning light. An elk herd grazed in the meadow, their tan coats luminous against the green grass. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents that would build as the day warmed. This was what I had come here for. This moment of peace and connection to something larger than human drama and family dysfunction. The natural world operated according to principles that were harsh but fair. Predators hunted and prey were vigilant, and weather patterns followed physical laws that played no favorites. There was no gaslighting in nature, no manipulation, no expectation that some organisms should constantly sacrifice their well-being so that other organisms could avoid consequences. I spent the morning hiking to the trailhead of the section I was responsible for monitoring. As a wilderness conservation officer, my job involved regular patrols of designated backcountry areas to check for environmental damage, illegal camping, wildlife issues, and trail maintenance needs. The work was physically demanding and paid modestly, but it aligned perfectly with my values and allowed me to spend significant time in the places I loved most. The trail I was checking that day climbed through lodgepole pine forest before breaking out above treeline into alpine terrain of rock and tundra. I noted several places where erosion was creating problems, marked the location of a fallen tree that would need to be removed, and documented evidence of a black bear that had been digging for grubs in a rotting log. The work was absorbing enough that for several hours I did not think about Rebecca or my parents or the messages I had deleted. When I returned to the cabin in the early afternoon, I found a sheriff's vehicle parked in my clearing. A deputy was sitting on my deck, apparently waiting for me. My heart rate increased as I approached, wondering if somehow Todd's family had convinced law enforcement that I was the one who had done something wrong. The deputy stood as I approached, a woman probably in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name tag identified her as Deputy Martinez. "Diana Castellano?" she asked. "Yes, that's me. I'm Deputy Martinez with the County Sheriff's Department. I received a call this morning regarding an incident at this property yesterday. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Of course. What kind of call?" She pulled out a small notebook. "A Rebecca Hartwell called to report that you threatened her and her family, forced them to leave this property under duress, and made statements about calling law enforcement to remove them. She's considering filing a harassment complaint. I wanted to get your side of the story." I felt my jaw tighten but kept my voice level. "Would you like to come inside? This is going to take a few minutes to explain." Deputy Martinez followed me into the cabin. I offered her water, which she accepted, and then I laid out the entire situation in chronological detail. I showed her the property deed that proved I was the sole owner. I showed her the text message exchange with Rebecca from 2 weeks earlier where I mentioned I would be here this weekend and she acknowledged it. I showed her photographs of my key ring that clearly indicated one key was missing from where it should have been, and I explained that Rebecca had admitted to copying the key without my permission during her last visit. So when you arrived yesterday, Deputy Martinez said, taking notes, you found approximately 15 people occupying your property without your permission? Correct. My sister's husband and his entire extended family. Rebecca claimed she had given them permission to use the cabin, but she has no authority to do that. She doesn't own the property, and I never gave her permission to allow other people to stay here. And what happened when you asked them to leave? They refused at first. They said I was being unreasonable and selfish. They claimed that since Rebecca is family, she had implied permission to use the property. I explained that's not how property rights work, and gave them 30 minutes to vacate. They did leave within that time frame, which is why I never actually called law enforcement, though I had told them I would if they refused. Deputy Martinez looked up from her notes. Did you threaten them in any way beyond saying you would call law enforcement to enforce your property rights? No. I didn't make any threats, didn't use any profanity, didn't engage in any behavior that could reasonably be construed as harassment. I simply asked them to leave my property, and told them what would happen if they didn't comply, which is exactly what I was entitled to do. She nodded slowly. Ms. Castellano, based on what you've told me and the documentation you've shown me, I don't see any basis for a harassment complaint. You were enforcing your property rights in a reasonable manner. However, I do need to inform you that your sister also mentioned some concerns about your mental state. She suggested you might be unstable. I felt a flash of anger but forced myself to remain calm. Deputy Martinez, I'm a wilderness conservation officer with the Department of Natural Resources. I carry a badge and have arrest authority in backcountry areas. I've been with the department for 11 years and have never had a single disciplinary issue or complaint. I own this property free and clear. I maintain it myself. I'm a tax-paying, law-abiding citizen who asked trespassers to vacate my property. The fact that my sister is attempting to paint me as mentally unstable because I enforced boundaries says a lot about her character and nothing about my mental health. I understand your frustration, Deputy Martinez said. For what it's worth, nothing about your demeanor or this property suggests instability. You've been calm, coherent, and well-organized in presenting your information. However, I wanted you to be aware of the allegation in case your sister escalates this situation. What do you mean escalates? Sometimes family disputes turn into campaigns to discredit the person who enforced boundaries. She might contact your employer, spread rumors in your community, or continue filing frivolous complaints. I've seen it before. People who are upset about facing consequences for their behavior often go on the offensive to make themselves look like the victim. I absorbed this information, so I should expect more retaliation. It's possible. My advice would be to document everything. Keep records of all communications. Don't respond to provocative messages. Don't engage with drama. Just live your life and maintain your boundaries. If she does anything that crosses the line into actual harassment or that interferes with your employment, you'll have evidence to support any actions you need to take. After Deputy Martinez left, I sat on my deck digesting this new information. Rebecca had not simply accepted the boundary I had enforced. She was actively working to undermine me, to create a narrative in which I was the unstable aggressor, and she was the innocent victim. The strategy was both predictable and infuriating. Rather than take responsibility for her actions, she was attempting to make me pay for daring to hold her accountable. I thought about Deputy Martinez's advice to document everything, and realized I needed to be more proactive about protecting myself. I spent the rest of the afternoon photographing the property, documenting the tire tracks on the meadow grass, the areas where Todd's family had disturbed my landscaping, and the overall condition of the cabin now that I had cleaned it. I made detailed notes about the timeline of events, recorded everything I could remember people saying during the confrontation, and backed up all of this information to cloud storage. Then I did something I had been avoiding. I called my supervisor at the Department of Natural Resources, a woman named Karen Chun who I had worked with for 8 years, and who I trusted to be fair and professional. I explained the situation concisely, focusing on the facts and the possibility that my sister might try to cause problems with my employment. Karen listened without interrupting, then said, Diana, thank you for giving me a heads up about this. For the record, unless someone provides actual evidence of genuine instability that affects your work performance, I'm not concerned. You're one of the most reliable officers I supervise, but I appreciate you keeping me informed. If your sister does contact this office, I'll handle it appropriately. I'm sorry to have to bring personal drama into work, I said. You're not bringing drama into work. Your sister is attempting to, which is very different. You enforced your property rights and now you're managing the fallout. That's not drama, that's adulting. Most people never learn how to do it, so they react badly when they encounter someone who has. After we hung up, I felt marginally better. At least my employment was not immediately at risk. But the conversation had clarified something important. This situation was not going to resolve quickly or easily. Rebecca had chosen escalation over accountability, which meant I needed to prepare for an extended conflict. The question was how far she would take it, and how much damage she was willing to cause in her attempt to avoid admitting she had been wrong. The remainder of the weekend passed without further incident, though the peace felt fragile, like the calm before a storm whose approach you can sense in the pressure changes and the quality of light. I completed my trail assessment work, documented the maintenance issues I had identified, and spent the evenings on my deck watching the changing patterns of weather move across the peaks. The physical beauty of the location remained unchanged, but my experience of it had been altered by the knowledge that my sanctuary had been violated, and that the violation would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate confrontation. On Sunday evening, I locked up the cabin and began the drive back to my apartment in Boulder, where I lived during the work week to be closer to the Department of Natural Resources regional office. The 2-hour drive took me from high alpine terrain down through progressively lower elevations, the landscape transforming from tundra and pine forest to foothills scrubland and finally to the edge of the Front Range urban corridor. I had always experienced this transition with mixed feelings, leaving behind the places I loved to return to the necessities of human infrastructure and social obligation. But this time the mixed feelings were sharper, more conflicted. My phone, which I had left in airplane mode for most of the weekend, began buzzing almost immediately when I turned it back on as I approached cell service range. 17 missed calls, 34 text messages, 6 voicemail messages. I waited until I was safely parked at my apartment before reviewing any of it, knowing that the content would be distracting and potentially upsetting. The messages fell into several categories. My parents had called multiple times, their messages progressing from requests that I call them back immediately to statements that my behavior was causing serious family problems to thinly veiled threats that there would be consequences if I did not make this right. Rebecca had sent a series of texts that oscillated between anger and self-pity, calling me heartless, selfish, and cruel while also claiming that I had humiliated her in front of Todd's family and damaged her marriage. Several unknown numbers had left voicemails that I assumed were from Todd's relatives based on the content, which ranged from attempts at guilt manipulation to outright verbal attacks on my character. But there were also 2 messages that stood out as different. One was from my Aunt Maureen, my mother's younger sister, who I had always gotten along with despite seeing her only occasionally. Her voicemail was brief and to the point. Diana, I heard about what happened at the cabin. I don't know all the details, but I know your sister well enough to suspect she's not telling the whole story. Call me when you get a chance. I'm on your side, whatever that turns out to mean. The other was from a number I did not recognize with a Seattle area code. The voicemail was from a woman who introduced herself as Lindsay Hartwell, Todd's younger sister. Her voice was hesitant but clear. Hi Diana, we haven't met, but I was at your cabin yesterday with my family. I wanted to apologize for being part of that situation. After we left and I had time to think about what actually happened, I realized you were completely right and we were completely wrong. My brother and your sister told us you had offered the cabin for our reunion, and we believed them without questioning it. That was naive on our part. I'm really sorry for the role I played in violating your property. You handled the situation with more grace than most people would have shown. These 2 messages, coming from people who had no obligation to reach out and every incentive to maintain family unity by taking the expected side, hit me with unexpected emotional force. I had been operating under the assumption that I was entirely alone in this conflict, that everyone who knew anything about the situation had aligned against me. The existence of even two people who were willing to question the dominant narrative and recognize that I might have legitimate grievances was profoundly validating. I called Aunt Maureen first. She answered on the second ring. "Diana, thank God. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Aunt Maureen. Did Rebecca call you?" "Your mother called me, actually. She was very upset and said you had done something terrible to Rebecca and ruined a family event. But your mother has a tendency to catastrophize, especially where Rebecca is concerned, so I wanted to hear your version before I formed any opinions." I laid out the facts for her, the same clear chronology I had presented to Deputy Martinez. Aunt Maureen listened without interrupting, and when I finished there was a long pause before she spoke. "That girl," she said finally, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. "Diana, I love my sister. But she has created a monster with Rebecca. Your parents have enabled her bad behavior for so long that Rebecca genuinely believes she's entitled to whatever she wants, whenever she wants it. And when someone finally says no to her, she can't process it. She thinks the person saying no is the problem rather than recognizing that her entitlement is the problem." "Mom thinks I should have just let them stay," I said. "She thinks I'm being rigid and unforgiving. Your mother thinks maintaining surface harmony is more important than addressing underlying dysfunction. That's been her approach to everything for as long as I've known her. But Diana, surface harmony that depends on one person constantly absorbing abuse is not harmony at all. It's just organized oppression." The phrase struck me as particularly apartment organized oppression. That was exactly what the family system had become. A structure in which my needs and boundaries were systematically subordinated to preserve a false peace that served everyone except me. "What should I do?" I asked, realizing that I was asking less for practical advice and more for affirmation that my perception of the situation was accurate. "You should do exactly what you're already doing. Maintain your boundaries. Don't engage with manipulation. Don't let people guilt you into accepting unacceptable behavior. And Diana, prepare yourself for the possibility that your relationship with your parents might change permanently. They've invested decades in the dynamic that has Rebecca at the center, and you in the supporting role. Challenging that dynamic threatens their entire worldview. They might not be capable of changing, which means you might need to accept that you'll have a different kind of relationship with them going forward." After we hung up, I sat in my car absorbing this conversation. Aunt Maureen had articulated something I had been feeling but had not quite put into words. The confrontation at the cabin was not really about a weekend or property rights or even Rebecca's specific behavior. It was about whether I would continue to participate in a family system that required my diminishment as the price of membership. And I had definitively answered that question by refusing to back down. I called Lindsay Hartwell next. She answered with obvious nervousness in her voice. "Diana? Thank you for calling me back. I wasn't sure you would. Thank you for reaching out. Your message meant a lot to me." I felt terrible after we left. The whole drive back to our hotel, I kept thinking about the situation from your perspective. You came to your own property and found it occupied by strangers, and when you asked us to leave, we acted like you were the unreasonable one. That must have been awful. "It was pretty surreal," I admitted. "Can I ask what you were told about the arrangement?" "Rebecca and Todd told us that you had generously offered your cabin for our family reunion. They made it sound like you had suggested it yourself and were happy to help out. They said you weren't planning to use it that weekend and that you wanted it to get more use because it just sat empty most of the time. None of us had any reason to question that story until you showed up, and it became obvious that the story was not accurate." "Did Todd or Rebecca say anything after I left?" Lindsay hesitated. "Todd was furious. He kept saying you were crazy and spiteful and that you had always been jealous of Rebecca. Rebecca mostly cried and said she couldn't believe her own sister would treat her so badly. But Diana, my mother pulled me aside before we left for Seattle, and she said something that stuck with me. She said that people who lie about small things will lie about big things, and that if Todd and Rebecca lied to us about having your permission, we should consider what else they might be lying about. Your mother sounds wise. She has good instincts about people. And she said your behavior during the confrontation was actually remarkably restrained. She said if someone had broken into her property and filled it with strangers, she would have called the police immediately without giving anyone a chance to leave voluntarily. She was impressed that you gave us 30 minutes and didn't escalate beyond what was necessary. We talked for another 10 minutes, and by the end of the conversation I had gained not only validation but also information. Lindsay told me that Todd's family had known for months that the reunion was planned but had only learned about the location 2 weeks earlier, which aligned with the timeline of when Rebecca must have decided to use my cabin without asking. She also mentioned that several of Todd's relatives had commented that the cabin was surprisingly well appointed and clearly expensive to maintain, which suggested that Rebecca and Todd might have been portraying my financial situation differently than reality. After ending the call, I went into my apartment and spent the evening documenting these conversations and adding them to the growing file of information I was accumulating about the situation. Deputy Martinez's advice about documentation was proving prescient. I had a feeling I was going to need a clear record of everything that happened and everyone's role in it. Monday morning I returned to work, determined to focus on my professional responsibilities and not allow the family drama to interfere with my job performance. But by 10 in the morning, Karen Chung called me into her office. "Diana, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. I received a phone call this morning from someone identifying herself as your mother. She was quite upset and wanted to discuss concerns about your mental health and whether you should be allowed to continue in a position that involves carrying a firearm and working in isolated conditions." My stomach dropped. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that personnel matters are confidential and that I could not discuss your employment status with anyone who is not authorized to receive that information. I also told her that the department has protocols for assessing officer fitness for duty, and that those protocols have not identified any concerns regarding your performance or mental health." Then I ended the call. "I'm so sorry, Karen. This is exactly what I was worried about." "Don't apologize. You did nothing wrong. Your mother, however, crossed a significant line. Attempting to interfere with someone's employment as retaliation for a personal dispute is serious business. I documented the call and filed a report with HR. If she contacts this office again, there will be consequences. Thank you for handling it that way. Diana, I've worked with you for 8 years. You're one of the most competent and stable officers I supervise. You show up on time, you do excellent work, you handle difficult situations with good judgment, and you've never given me a moment of concern about your mental health or professional capabilities. Whatever is happening in your family, it has nothing to do with your fitness for this job. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." I returned to my desk feeling shaken but also angry in a way that was clarifying rather than paralyzing. My mother had not simply pressured me to back down or express disappointment in my choices. She had actively attempted to damage my career, to undermine my professional reputation, to potentially cost me the job I had worked for over a decade to build. This was not the behavior of someone who was concerned about family harmony. This was the behavior of someone who was willing to destroy me for refusing to comply with her demands. The realization that my mother had escalated to this level forced me to reconsider my entire understanding of our relationship. I had always thought of her as loving but misguided, as someone who prioritized the wrong things but who ultimately cared about my well-being. But someone who genuinely cared about my well-being would not attempt to sabotage my employment. Someone who genuinely cared about me would not weaponize concerns about mental health as a tool for social control. My mother had revealed herself to be not merely an enabler of Rebecca's dysfunction, but an active participant in a campaign to punish me for enforcing boundaries. During my lunch break, I received a text from Rebecca. It was the first direct communication from her since the weekend, and it was lengthy. "Diana, I don't even know where to begin. What you did this weekend was unforgivable. You humiliated me in front of Todd's entire family. You made me look like a liar and a criminal. Todd's parents think I'm unstable because my own sister treated me like a stranger. Todd is questioning whether he can trust me because you made it seem like I'm some kind of thief. My marriage is suffering because of your selfish need to prove some kind of point. I have apologized to Todd's family over and over, but the damage is done. They think our family is dysfunctional and that I come from chaos. Do you have any idea what you've cost me? And for what? So you could have your precious cabin to yourself for one weekend? So you could feel powerful and in control? You've always been jealous of me. Jealous that I have a husband and a family while you're alone in your little apartment playing ranger in the woods. Well, congratulations. You got to flex your property rights. I hope it was worth destroying our relationship and hurting Mom and Dad. They're devastated, by the way. Mom can barely function because she's so upset about this. Dad says he doesn't even recognize you anymore. You've become hard and cold and completely self-absorbed. The old Diana would never have done something like this. I don't know who you are anymore, but you're not my sister. I read the message 3 times, analyzing it with the same careful attention I would give to a complex field report. The structure was sophisticated in its manipulation. It began by positioning herself as the victim of my actions rather than as the perpetrator of the original offense. It used emotional language designed to trigger guilt and shame. It threatened consequences to her marriage and relationship with Todd's family, implying that I was responsible for those consequences rather than acknowledging that her own dishonesty had created them. It attacked my life choices and personal circumstances, suggesting that my enforcement of boundaries stemmed from jealousy rather than from legitimate grievance. It invoked our parents' distress as a weapon, making me responsible for their emotional states. And it ended with an identity attack, claiming that my authentic self was somehow a betrayal of who I was supposed to be. The message was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, and a year ago it might have worked. A year ago I might have read those words and felt the intended guilt, might have questioned whether my boundaries were really worth the cost, might have considered apologizing just to restore peace. But I had spent the past months reading about family systems and boundaries and narcissistic dynamics, trying to understand why my relationships with my family always left me feeling drained and diminished. I had learned to recognize manipulation tactics, and Rebecca's message deployed nearly all of them. I did not respond. There was nothing I could say that would penetrate Rebecca's defensive narrative or convince her to take responsibility for her choices. Any response would simply provide her with ammunition to use against me, either through selective quotation or through misrepresentation of my words. The only winning move was not to play. Instead, I forwarded the message to Aunt Maureen with a brief note asking if this seemed reasonable to her. She responded within minutes with a single word: textbook. Then she added, "This is classic Darvo. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. She's denying her responsibility, attacking your character, and positioning herself as the victim of your aggression. Don't engage with it." That evening I attended a book club meeting that I had been part of for 2 years. A group of women who worked in various environmental and conservation fields, and who met monthly to discuss books related to nature, ecology, and environmental philosophy. I had considered canceling because I was emotionally exhausted, but I forced myself to go because I knew that isolating myself would not help anything. During the social time before the discussion began, one of the members, a wildlife biologist named Sarah who I had become friendly with, pulled me aside. "Diana, I saw something on Facebook today that I thought you should know about. There's a post that's being shared around by someone named Rebecca Hartwell. She's claiming her sister forced her family out of a cabin during a family emergency, refused to help when elderly relatives needed shelter, and is showing signs of serious mental instability. The post has a lot of engagement and people are being really harsh in the comments. I wouldn't normally bring up social media drama, but I recognized your name from when she mentioned her unstable sister Diana, who works in wilderness conservation. I wanted you to know in case it affects your work or reputation." The ground seemed to shift beneath me. "Can you show me?" Sarah pulled out her phone and navigated to the post. It was long, detailed, and carefully constructed to present Rebecca as a sympathetic figure dealing with an unreasonable and potentially dangerous sister. The post claimed that Rebecca had arranged a family gathering at a cabin that had been in our family for generations, only to have me show up and forcibly evict everyone including children and elderly people with health conditions. It suggested that I had made threats and displayed erratic behavior. It hinted that I might be having a breakdown related to work stress and isolation. It asked for prayers and support during this difficult time. The comments were extensive and uniformly supportive of Rebecca. Hundreds of people, none of whom knew me or had any knowledge of the actual situation, were sharing their outrage about my behavior and their sympathy for Rebecca's plight. Several comments suggested that someone should report me to my employer. Others speculated about what kind of trauma or mental illness would cause someone to behave the way I allegedly had. A few people shared their own stories of dealing with difficult family members, positioning me as a villain in a narrative I had no opportunity to correct. "This is defamation," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Nearly everything in this post is either misleading or outright false." "That's what I figured," Sarah said. I know you well enough to know you wouldn't do what she's describing, at least not without very good reason. But Diana, this is spreading fast. You might want to consider how you're going to respond to it. I spent the rest of the evening barely able to focus on the book discussion, my mind racing through options and implications. Rebecca had taken the conflict public in the most damaging way possible, constructing a narrative designed to destroy my reputation and credibility. The post would be seen by colleagues, by community members, by anyone who might search my name online. It would potentially affect my professional opportunities and my standing in the conservation community. And because social media platforms favored engagement over accuracy, there was little I could do to counter it effectively. After the meeting ended, I sat in my car in the parking lot and called the one person I knew who might have useful advice about this situation. My friend Marcus was an attorney who specialized in employment law, and while this was not exactly his area of expertise, he had enough legal knowledge to help me understand my options. Diana, I'm sorry you're dealing with this, he said after I explained the situation. Social media defamation is tricky because platforms have broad immunity under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. You can't sue Facebook for hosting the content, and suing your sister would be expensive, time-consuming, and might just give her claims more attention. However, you do have some options, such as: first, document everything. Screenshot the post and all the comments before anything gets deleted. Document the actual facts of what happened with as much evidence as you can gather. Second, consider whether any of the specific claims in the post rise to the level of defamation per se, meaning claims that are so damaging that you don't have to prove specific harm. Accusations of mental instability that could affect your employment might qualify. Third, think about whether you want to respond publicly at all. Sometimes the best response to online drama is no response. But if I don't respond, people will assume everything she said is true. Some people will assume that regardless of what you say. Others will question her narrative if you provide no fuel for the fire. And the people who actually know you won't believe her claims anyway. You have to ask yourself whether public engagement will make things better or worse. We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of the conversation I had a clearer sense of my options, none of which were particularly satisfying. I could respond publicly, but that would likely escalate the situation and provide Rebecca with more ammunition. I could pursue legal action, but that would be expensive and time-consuming and might not actually stop the damage. Or I could document everything, inform the people who needed to know, and otherwise refuse to engage with the public spectacle Rebecca was creating. I chose the third option, but with one addition. I drafted a brief, factual statement that I posted to my own social media accounts, which I rarely used but which were connected to my professional identity. The statement was carefully worded to avoid inflammatory language, while correcting the most significant falsehoods. I recently became aware of social media posts making claims about my behavior during a property dispute with a family member. I want to clarify the facts for anyone who might be concerned. I am the sole owner of a mountain cabin that I purchased and renovated over several years. On a weekend when I had planned to use the property for work-related trail maintenance, I arrived to find the cabin occupied by approximately 15 people who were there without my knowledge or permission. I asked them to leave, which they did voluntarily. No one was threatened, no one was forcibly removed, and no emergency situation existed. The characterization of these events in other social media posts is not accurate. I will not be engaging in public debate about this private matter, but I wanted to ensure that anyone who knows me professionally has access to factual information. The statement was understated and factual, designed to provide basic truth without feeding drama or creating opportunities for further conflict. I posted it and then immediately muted notifications, not wanting to watch whatever response it generated. That night I lay in bed unable to sleep, my mind cycling through everything that had happened over the past few days. The situation had escalated far beyond what I had imagined possible when I had simply asked trespassers to leave my property. Rebecca had mobilized our parents, attempted to interfere with my employment, and launched a public campaign to destroy my reputation. The level of retaliation was so disproportionate to my offense, which was simply enforcing basic property rights, that it revealed something important about the family system I had been part of. The system could not tolerate my defection. It required my participation in the assigned role of accommodating supporter, And when I refused to play that role, the system responded with overwhelming force designed to compel my return to compliance. My mother's call to my employer, Rebecca's social media campaign, the coordinated pressure from multiple family members, all of it was designed to make the cost of maintaining boundaries so high that I would capitulate and restore the previous dynamic. But I was not going to capitulate. The clarity I had felt during the confrontation at the cabin had not diminished. If anything, it had strengthened as I watched the lengths to which people would go to avoid admitting they had been wrong. I had done nothing shameful, nothing unethical, nothing that required apology or correction. I had defended my property and my dignity, and I would continue to do so regardless of what it cost me in terms of family relationships or social comfort. The price of self-respect, I was learning, could be extraordinarily high, but the price of continuing to accept disrespect was ultimately higher, measured in the slow erosion of identity and the accumulation of resentments that eventually poison everything they touch. I had chosen the difficult path, and I would see it through to whatever conclusion it reached. The week following the social media incident passed in a state of heightened alertness that left me exhausted by evening despite spending my days doing work I normally found energizing. Every email notification carried the potential for another escalation. Every phone call might bring news of some new front in Rebecca's campaign. And the ambient stress of waiting for the next attack was almost worse than the attacks themselves. I moved through my professional responsibilities with mechanical efficiency, grateful for the structure and clear objectives that field work provided, but beneath the surface competence I could feel something shifting in how I understood my place in the world. Tuesday brought an unexpected development. I received an email from the social media platform informing me that Rebecca's post about the cabin incident had been removed for violating community standards regarding harassment and false information. The message provided no details about who had reported it or what specific violation had triggered the removal, but the effect was immediate and substantial. The narrative that had been spreading through networks of Rebecca's friends and acquaintances suddenly disappeared, leaving only fragments in screenshots and memories. People who had been sharing and commenting found the post simply gone, replaced by a generic message about content that was no longer available. I learned later that day, through a message from Lindsay Hartwell, that Todd's mother had been the one to report the post. She had apparently become increasingly uncomfortable with the public nature of Rebecca's accusations, and had done some independent research into Colorado property law and trespass statutes. Upon discovering that my version of events was legally accurate, and that Rebecca's characterization was misleading at best, she had not only reported the post but had also sent a private message to Rebecca expressing her disappointment in the deception. Lindsay forwarded me the message with Todd's mother's permission, and reading it provided a satisfaction that was both gratifying and melancholy. The message was direct and unsparing. Todd's mother wrote that she had raised her son to value honesty and integrity, that she was ashamed to learn her family had been used as unwitting participants in what amounted to theft of property, and that she expected Rebecca and Todd to take responsibility for their actions, rather than attempting to destroy the reputation of someone who had been wronged. She concluded by stating that until Rebecca demonstrated genuine remorse and made meaningful amends, she would not be welcome at future family gatherings, and that Todd would need to decide whether his loyalty was to his wife's dishonesty or to his family's values. The ramifications of this message extended beyond the immediate conflict. According to Lindsay, it had created a significant rift between Todd and his parents, with Todd defending Rebecca's actions and his mother refusing to back down from her position. The family reunion that had been the ostensible reason for occupying my cabin had concluded with damaged relationships and uncomfortable conversations about trust and honesty. The irony was not lost on me that Rebecca's attempt to provide Todd's family with a pleasant gathering had instead created the exact kind of family discord she had accused me of causing. Wednesday brought a different kind of challenge. I received a certified letter from an attorney representing Rebecca and Todd. The letter claimed that I had caused them emotional distress through my actions at the cabin, damaged Rebecca's reputation through my social media statement, and created hardship by forcing them to find alternative accommodations at the last minute. The letter demanded a written apology, financial compensation for the cost of hotel rooms for Todd's family, and a commitment that I would allow Rebecca continued access to the cabin for future family events. If I did not comply with these demands within 10 days, the letter stated, they would pursue legal action for damages. I read the letter twice, my initial shock giving way to a cold anger that felt clean and clarifying. The audacity of demanding an apology from the person they had wronged, of seeking financial compensation for consequences that flowed directly from their own dishonesty, of insisting on future access to property they had already demonstrated they could not be trusted with, revealed a level of entitlement that was almost impressive in its completeness. Rebecca and Todd had so thoroughly constructed a reality in which they were the victims that they apparently believed a court would validate their delusions. I immediately forwarded the letter to Marcus, my attorney friend, along with all the documentation I had accumulated about the incident. His response came within hours, and it was reassuring in its directness. The letter was what he called a demand letter designed to intimidate rather than a serious precursor to viable litigation. The claims were weak, the damages were speculative, and any attorney who actually filed a lawsuit based on these facts would be wasting their client's money and potentially exposing themselves to sanctions for bringing frivolous claims. His advice was to have him draft a response that firmly rejected all demands, established the factual record, and made clear that any further harassment would result in counterclaims for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. "Let me handle this," Marcus said when I called him after reading his email. "You've been managing this situation alone, and that's admirable, but you need legal representation now. Rebecca and Todd have crossed the line from family conflict into legal territory, and you need someone who can respond in kind without the emotional complications you're dealing with." "I don't want to escalate this into a full legal battle," I said. Though even as I spoke the words I recognized they reflected an old pattern of trying to minimize conflict rather than an accurate assessment of the situation. "Diana, they escalated it into a legal battle when they hired an attorney to send you demands. You didn't choose this battlefield, but now that you're on it, you need to fight effectively. That means responding with legal force that makes clear you will not be bullied or intimidated. Trust me on this. I've seen situations like this before. People who send demand letters expecting capitulation usually back down fast when they encounter serious resistance." I authorized Marcus to represent me and to draft whatever response he deemed appropriate. Within 2 days he had prepared a letter that was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. It methodically dismantled every claim in Rebecca's attorney's letter, cited specific statutes and case law supporting my actions, detailed the actual sequence of events with reference to documentary evidence, and concluded with a clear statement that I would vigorously defend against any lawsuit while pursuing all available counterclaims including but not limited to trespass, conversion, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and defamation. The letter also put Rebecca's attorney on notice that continued pursuit of meritless claims might result in a complaint to the State Bar Association regarding ethical violations. Marcus sent the letter via certified mail and email, ensuring there could be no claim it had not been received. Then we waited to see whether Rebecca and Todd would continue down the path of legal confrontation or would recognize they were outmatched. During this waiting period, I made a decision that felt both overdue and frightening. I blocked my parents' phone numbers and email addresses. The decision came after my mother left a voicemail that began with concern about my well-being but quickly devolved into accusations that I was destroying the family, that I had always been difficult and contrary, that Rebecca was suffering because of my selfishness, and that if I had any decency I would apologize and make things right. The message ended with my mother saying that she and my father had decided I was no longer welcome at family gatherings until I demonstrated that I could behave appropriately and put family first. The threat of exclusion from family events was clearly intended to pressure me into compliance, but it had the opposite effect. The idea of attending gatherings where I would be expected to interact pleasantly with people who had attempted to sabotage my career, destroy my reputation, and steal my property was not appealing. The idea of being in rooms where Rebecca would be centered and supported, while I would be subtly or overtly blamed for all the conflict, was exhausting to even contemplate. My mother's ultimatum, intended as punishment, felt more like liberation. I typed a brief email before I blocked their addresses, wanting to have the last word, even if I would never see their response. The email was short and factual. "Mom and Dad, I am blocking your contact information because your communications have become abusive, and I need to protect my mental health. I did nothing wrong by enforcing my property rights when Rebecca trespassed. The fact that you cannot recognize this and have instead chosen to attack me reveals that our relationship is not healthy or sustainable. I wish you well, But I will not be participating in family events or maintaining contact until you demonstrate through sustained changed behavior that you can treat me with basic respect. This is not negotiable. I hit send before I could second-guess the decision, then systematically blocked their numbers, their email addresses, and their social media profiles. The finality of it was both terrifying and exhilarating. I had just severed contact with my parents, an action that felt simultaneously like self-care and like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But as I sat with the decision, I recognized that the relationship I was ending had not been serving me for years. I was not losing something valuable. I was releasing something that had been slowly poisoning my sense of self-worth and my capacity to maintain healthy boundaries. Aunt Maureen called that evening, having apparently heard from my mother about my decision. "Diana, your mother called me in hysterics. She says you've cut off all contact and that you're having some kind of breakdown. I wanted to check in and see how you're actually doing rather than relying on her interpretation." "I'm doing surprisingly well, Aunt Maureen." I blocked them because continuing to engage with their abuse was not helping anything. My mother called my employer trying to get me fired. Rebecca launched a social media campaign to destroy my reputation. They sent me a legal demand letter asking for money and an apology. At some point you have to recognize that people who are supposed to love you are actually attacking you, and protecting yourself is not a breakdown. It is sanity. I completely agree with you. Your mother is going to paint this as you abandoning the family, but from where I sit, the family abandoned you a long time ago. You just finally recognized it and responded accordingly. "Do you think I am making a mistake?" I asked, needing to hear from someone whose judgment I trusted that I was not overreacting or being needlessly dramatic. "Not even a little bit. Diana, I watched my sister enable Rebecca's bad behavior for decades. I watched her prioritize Rebecca's feelings over your well-being time and time again. I watched her teach both of you that Rebecca's needs mattered and yours did not. And I said nothing because I told myself it was not my place to interfere in how my sister raised her children. But I should have said something. I should have told you years ago that you deserved better. So let me say it now. You deserve better. You deserve parents who celebrate your accomplishments instead of taking them for granted. You deserve a sister who respects your boundaries instead of violating them. You deserve a family that supports you instead of attacking you when you stand up for yourself. And if the family you were born into cannot provide that, then you are absolutely right to create distance until they can." We talked for over an hour, and by the end of the conversation I felt more grounded in my decision. Aunt Maureen had witnessed the family dynamics from a position of relative objectivity, and her validation that my perception was accurate and my response was appropriate carried significant weight. She also shared some information that provided useful context. Apparently Rebecca and Todd were experiencing serious financial problems that predated the cabin incident. Todd had made some poor investment decisions and they were behind on their mortgage. The free use of my cabin had been attractive not just for the convenience, but because they genuinely could not afford to pay for accommodations for Todd's family reunion. This information reframed some of Rebecca's desperation and aggression as stemming not just from entitlement, but from actual financial stress. Understanding the financial pressure they were under did not excuse their behavior, but it did help me comprehend why they had been so unwilling to simply accept responsibility and move on. Admitting they had been wrong would have meant acknowledging they had damaged relationships with Todd's family over an act of theft committed primarily to save money they did not have. It would have required confronting the reality that their financial situation was serious enough to drive them to unethical behavior. It was easier, emotionally if not practically, to construct a narrative in which I was the villain and they were the victims of my unreasonableness. The following weekend I returned to the cabin, determined to reclaim it fully as my sanctuary rather than as a site of conflict. I spent Saturday replacing the locks on all the doors, installing a security system with cameras covering all approaches to the property, and putting up discreet signage indicating that the property was under video surveillance and that trespassing would be prosecuted. The work was practical and necessary, but it also served a psychological function. Each lock I changed and each camera I installed represented a boundary reinforced, a statement that this space was mine to protect, and that I would do whatever was necessary to maintain that protection. Sunday I hiked to a remote alpine lake that required a strenuous 4-hour climb through increasingly challenging terrain. The physical exertion was demanding enough to quiet the constant mental of processing and analyzing that had dominated my thoughts for weeks. At the lake, which sat in a cirque surrounded by 13,000-foot peaks, I sat on a boulder and allowed myself to simply exist in the moment. The water was an impossible shade of turquoise created by glacial flour suspended in the meltwater. The air was thin and cold and sharp in my lungs. The silence was broken only by the wind and the occasional call of a Clark's nutcracker in the nearby pines. In that moment of solitude and beauty, I recognized something important. The conflict with my family, as painful and consuming as it had been, had also clarified what I valued and who I wanted to be. I valued honesty over convenience. I valued boundaries over false harmony. I valued self-respect over social approval. These values had always been present in me, but I had been willing to compromise them in the name of maintaining family relationships that were ultimately incompatible with those values. The confrontation at the cabin had forced a reckoning that was probably overdue, and while the process was difficult, the outcome was ultimately aligned with my authentic self. I thought about the person I had been 6 months earlier, someone who would have probably allowed Rebecca to use the cabin despite the lack of permission, who would have swallowed her anger and accepted the violation because making waves seemed worse than absorbing disrespect. That version of myself would have preserved the surface relationships while accumulating resentment and self-betrayal. The person I was becoming, the person who had enforced boundaries and accepted the consequences, was someone I respected more even as I grieved for the family connections that were being lost in the process. The hike down from the lake was easier than the ascent, and I arrived back at the cabin as the sun was setting. I made dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat on the deck watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The Milky Way was visible here in a way it never was in the city, a river of light stretching across the heavens. I thought about perspective, about how the conflicts that felt enormous and all-consuming in the moment were infinitesimal against the scale of geological time and cosmic distance. The mountains I was looking at had been shaped over millions of years by forces that made human drama seem trivial. Yet the human drama still mattered because I had to live inside it, had to make choices about how to conduct myself and what I would accept. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Rebecca's attorney responded. They are withdrawing all demands and will not be pursuing litigation. The letter from our office apparently convinced them that continuing would be expensive and embarrassing. You can relax. This part is over. I read the message 3 times, allowing the information to settle. The legal threat had evaporated, neutralized by Marcus's competent representation, and the weakness of Rebecca's claims. One significant source of stress had been eliminated. But I recognized that the deeper issues remained unresolved. Rebecca had not suddenly become a different person, my parents had not experienced an epiphany about their enabling behavior, and the family system had not transformed into something healthy. What had changed was my relationship to that system. I had extracted myself from the role I had been assigned, and I was learning to build a life that did not depend on their approval or participation. Monday morning I met with Karen Chan to update her on the situation, and to thank her for her support during what had been a difficult period. Diana, you handled this entire situation with remarkable professionalism, she told me. You never let your personal crisis affect your work quality. You communicated clearly about potential issues. You took appropriate steps to protect yourself legally and professionally. That is exactly what we want to see from our officers when they face challenging circumstances. I appreciate that, Karen. I was worried that the family drama would reflect poorly on me or on the department. The only person who reflected poorly on themselves was your mother when she called here trying to get you fired. That kind of behavior tells me everything I need to know about the family dynamics you were dealing with. The fact that you stood up to it rather than continuing to absorb abuse shows strength of character, not instability. The conversation reminded me that while I had lost some relationships through this process, I had also gained clarity about which relationships were genuine, and which were conditional on my compliance with others' expectations. Karen's support, Aunt Maureen's validation, Lindsay's apology, Marcus's advocacy, and Sarah's heads-up about the social media post all represented people who had shown up for me in meaningful ways during a crisis. These relationships, based on mutual respect and authentic connection, rather than obligation or familial role, were the foundation of the support system I was building to replace the dysfunctional family structure I was leaving behind. That evening I did something I had been avoiding. I wrote in my journal, a practice I had maintained sporadically for years, but had abandoned during the most intense period of the conflict, because I had been too overwhelmed to process my thoughts in writing. I wrote about the confrontation at the cabin, about the escalating retaliation, about my decision to block my parents, and about the strange combination of loss and liberation I was experiencing. The act of writing helped me externalize the experience, to see it as a narrative with a beginning, middle, and an arc that was still unfolding, rather than as a chaotic swirl of emotions and reactions. As I wrote, I recognized patterns that extended far beyond this particular incident. I saw how the dynamic with Rebecca had been established in childhood and reinforced over decades. I saw how my parents had created and maintained a system in which one child's needs were prioritized at the expense of the other's well-being. I saw how I had participated in my own diminishment by accepting that system as normal rather than recognizing it as dysfunctional. And I saw how the cabin confrontation had been a catalyst for a transformation that was necessary, even though it was painful. The person I was becoming through this process was someone who understood that love and respect were not the same thing, that family relationships had to be based on mutual regard rather than unilateral accommodation, and that walking away from toxicity was sometimes the most loving thing you could do for yourself. These lessons were being learned at a high cost, but they were lessons that would serve me for the rest of my life. I was being forged in the fire of this conflict, and what emerged from the flames would be stronger and more authentic than what had entered them. I finished writing and closed my journal, feeling more centered than I had in weeks. The acute crisis phase of the situation appeared to be over. Rebecca's legal threats had been neutralized. Her social media campaign had been shut down. My employment was secure. My boundaries were firmly established and reinforced with both legal documentation and physical security measures. What remained was the long process of rebuilding my sense of self and my social connections in a way that reflected my values rather than others' expectations. The weekend had given me space to process and to plan. The week ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities. But for the first time since that shocking moment when I had stood in my own doorway being told to leave, I felt confident that I was moving in the right direction. The path was difficult and uncertain, but it was mine. And that was enough. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that felt simultaneously normal and entirely transformed. I returned to my regular work schedule, conducting wildlife surveys in the backcountry, monitoring trail conditions, and coordinating with other conservation officers on regional projects. The familiar routines provided structure and purpose, anchoring me through a period when my personal life remained in flux. Yet beneath the surface of professional competence, I was navigating a fundamental reorganization of my identity and my understanding of what family meant. The silence from my parents was absolute. After I blocked their contact information, no attempts were made to reach me through alternative channels. The work was physically demanding and intellectually engaging, requiring constant decision-making about route selection, data collection protocols, and risk management in an environment where help was hours or days away. On the third evening, as we sat around our camp stove preparing dinner above Treeline with the sun setting over distant peaks, the wildlife biologist named Marcus, no relation to my attorney friend, asked a question that had apparently been on his mind for some time. "Diana, I have been meaning to ask you something. There were some rumors going around the conservation community a few weeks ago about some kind of family conflict you were involved in. Someone showed me a social media post that painted you in a pretty negative light. But working with you these past few days, I cannot reconcile that portrayal with the person I am observing. You have been professional, competent, safety-conscious, and easy to work with. So I am curious whether there is a story there you are comfortable sharing, or whether I should just ignore the rumors as baseless." I appreciated his directness and his willingness to ask me directly rather than simply accepting second-hand information as accurate. Around the camp stove, with the other team members listening but not pressuring me to respond, I provided a condensed version of what had occurred. I explained about the cabin, about finding it occupied without permission, about my sister's response and my parents' retaliation, and about the social media campaign that had briefly gained traction before being removed for violating platform policies. The group was quiet when I finished. Then the Forest Service botanist, a woman in her 50s named Patricia who had been working in wilderness conservation longer than I had been alive, spoke with the kind of authority that comes from decades of experience. "Diana, I had a remarkably similar situation with my own family about 15 years ago. Different details but the same fundamental dynamic. I had built a successful career, I had resources and independence, and certain family members felt entitled to access those resources without my consent. When I established boundaries, I was painted as the villain. It nearly destroyed me emotionally until I realized that people who genuinely care about you do not punish you for advocating for yourself. It sounds like you learned that lesson faster than I did, which speaks well of your judgment and your backbone. The validation from someone I respected professionally, and who had no stake in supporting me beyond professional courtesy, meant more than I could easily articulate. We spent another hour discussing family systems, boundaries, and the particular challenges women in male-dominated fields often face when they succeed in ways that disrupt traditional family expectations. The conversation was wide-ranging and intellectually stimulating, touching on sociology, psychology, and organizational behavior. By the time we retreated to our tents for the night, I felt a sense of belonging and acceptance that had been absent from my family relationships for as long as I could remember. The wilderness assessment concluded successfully, with comprehensive data collected and no safety incidents despite challenging terrain and unpredictable weather. Karen Chan praised the quality of the work and mentioned that she was recommending me for a leadership development program that could accelerate my advancement within the department. The professional recognition was gratifying, but more important was the realization that I had led a complex operation competently, while simultaneously processing significant personal upheaval. The version of myself that had stood frozen in the cabin doorway 6 weeks earlier, shocked by Rebecca's audacity, felt distant. I had evolved through crisis into someone more solid, more certain of her capabilities and her worth. Returning to civilization after 4 days in wilderness always required a period of readjustment. The noise of traffic, the visual clutter of commercial development, the constant connectivity of phones and internet, all of it felt overwhelming after days of simplicity and silence. But this time the return also brought a message that complicated my tentative sense of equilibrium. Aunt Maureen had called multiple times and left a voicemail asking me to contact her as soon as possible regarding a family emergency. I called her back from the parking lot of the ranger station where we had concluded our debrief, my stomach tight with apprehension. Aunt Maureen answered immediately, her voice strained. "Diana, thank God. I have been trying to reach you for 2 days. Your father had a heart attack. He is stable now, but it was serious. He is at Denver Presbyterian Hospital in the cardiac unit." The information hit me with unexpected force. Despite everything that had transpired, despite the blocked numbers and the severed contact, he was still my father. The idea that he might have died while I was unreachable in the wilderness created a complicated knot of emotions I was not prepared to process in a parking lot surrounded by colleagues. "When did this happen?" I asked, keeping my voice level. 3 days ago. Your mother tried to reach you but obviously could not because of the blocked numbers. She asked me to contact you once she realized I might have better luck. Diana, I know the situation with your parents is complicated right now, but your father is asking for you. He wants to see you. What does he want to say to me? Is this about reconciliation, or is this about pressuring me to apologize to Rebecca? Aunt Maureen sighed. Honestly, I do not know. Your mother would not let me speak to him directly. But Diana, whatever his motivations, he did have a heart attack and he is asking for his daughter. You need to decide whether you want to see him or not, but you should make that decision based on what you need rather than on anger about past conflicts. I told her I would think about it and call her back. Then I sat in my truck staring at the mountains visible beyond the town, trying to sort through competing impulses and principles. Part of me wanted to maintain the boundary I had established, to refuse to be manipulated by a medical crisis into abandoning my position. That voice argued that my father had made choices that led to our estrangement, that his heart attack did not erase his attempts to pressure me into accepting abuse, and that showing up at the hospital would signal that boundaries could be violated if the stakes were raised high enough. But another voice, quieter but persistent, suggested that some moments transcended ongoing conflicts. If my father died without us having a final conversation, I would have to live with that reality for the rest of my life. The question was whether I could live with it more easily than I could live with the possibility of being manipulated back into a dysfunctional dynamic by rushing to his bedside in a moment of crisis. I called Marcus, my attorney friend, seeking perspective from someone who understood both the legal and emotional dimensions of the situation. His advice was characteristically pragmatic. Diana, this is ultimately a personal decision that only you can make. But if you do decide to go to the hospital, I would suggest some boundaries. No letters arrived in the mail, no messages were relayed through mutual acquaintances, no olive branches were extended through neutral parties. The completeness of the cutoff confirmed what I had suspected, but had not wanted to fully acknowledge. My parents' love had always been conditional, predicated on my willingness to fulfill a specific role in the family system. When I refused to continue playing that role, their interest in maintaining a relationship evaporated. This realization was clarifying even as it was painful, stripping away any remaining illusions about the nature of our connection. Rebecca's silence was equally complete but carried different implications. According to Aunt Maureen, who remained in sporadic contact with my mother and reported back with information she thought I should know, Rebecca was portraying herself throughout her social circle as the victim of an unhinged sister who had irrationally destroyed family bonds over a trivial property dispute. The narrative she had constructed bore little resemblance to actual events, but it served its purpose within her social ecosystem, generating sympathy and support while insulating her from any need to examine her own behavior. I had expected this response and was not surprised by it, but I was struck by the energy Rebecca was investing in maintaining a false narrative rather than simply acknowledging what had happened and moving forward. What I had not fully anticipated was the ripple effect the confrontation would have beyond my immediate family. Extended relatives began reaching out, some offering support and others seeking to understand what had transpired. My father's brother, Uncle James, called one evening after apparently hearing a version of events from my mother that troubled him enough to seek clarification. When I explained the actual sequence of events, complete with documentation and timeline, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Diana, I owe you an apology. Your mother told me you had become unstable and were making wild accusations against Rebecca. She painted a picture of a troubled person lashing out at family members who were trying to help. I believed her because, well, she is my sister-in-law and I had no reason to think she would misrepresent things so dramatically. But what you are describing is completely different. If Rebecca really did take your key without permission and then occupied your property without asking, you were entirely within your rights to respond as you did. The conversation with Uncle James lasted over an hour. He asked detailed questions, reviewed photographs and documentation I sent him via email during our call, and ultimately concluded that my parents had been either willfully dishonest or so committed to protecting Rebecca that they had constructed a reality divorce from fact. He mentioned that he had noticed patterns over the years where Rebecca received different treatment than I did, where her failures were excused and her needs were prioritized, but he had dismissed these observations as normal sibling dynamics rather than recognizing them as symptomatic of a dysfunctional system. What are you going to do now? He asked near the end of our conversation. Are you planning to reconcile with your parents at some point? That depends entirely on whether they are willing to acknowledge what actually happened and to treat me with basic respect going forward. I am not interested in a reconciliation that requires me to pretend the past few months did not occur or to accept responsibility for conflicts they created. If they can demonstrate genuine change, I am open to rebuilding a relationship. But I am not holding my breath waiting for that to happen. That seems like a reasonable position. For what it is worth, I think you have handled this entire situation with more maturity and restraint than most people would have managed. I hope your parents eventually recognize what they are losing by choosing to defend Rebecca rather than acknowledging the truth. Similar conversations unfolded with other relatives over the subsequent weeks. My mother's sister Maureen continued to provide steady support and validation, often sharing information about family dynamics from her perspective, as someone who had witnessed them for decades, but had not been directly involved. A cousin I had been close to in childhood reached out after hearing fragments of the story and wanted to understand what had happened. Todd's sister Lindsay maintained periodic contact, updating me on developments within Todd's family that had resulted from the cabin incident. According to Lindsay, the revelation that Todd and Rebecca had lied about having permission to use my property had created lasting damage to their relationship with Todd's parents. The family reunion that was supposed to strengthen bonds had instead exposed character flaws that could not be ignored. Todd's mother had apparently told several people that she now questioned everything Todd and Rebecca had told her over the years, wondering what else might have been misrepresented or fabricated. The loss of trust was proving difficult to repair, and Todd was reportedly frustrated that what he viewed as a minor deception had generated such significant consequences. This information provided insight into why Rebecca's legal threats had been withdrawn so quickly. The attorney representing them had presumably advised that pursuing litigation would require discovery, depositions, and testimony that would further expose their dishonesty to public scrutiny. Better to withdraw quietly than to risk additional damage to relationships and reputations through formal legal proceedings. The calculation was rational from a strategic perspective, even if it left unresolved the underlying issues that had created the conflict. My work life remained insulated from the family drama, though I remained vigilant for any signs that Rebecca or my parents might make additional attempts to interfere with my employment. Karen Chun had assured me that the department's Human Resources Office was aware of the situation and would immediately flag any communications from my family members as inappropriate contact to be documented rather than acted upon. This institutional protection allowed me to focus on my responsibilities without constant anxiety about professional sabotage. In mid-October, I was assigned to lead a multi-day backcountry assessment in the Weminish Wilderness, the largest wilderness area in Colorado. The assignment required assembling a small team of rangers and biologists, organizing logistics for wilderness travel, and conducting comprehensive surveys of wildlife populations, vegetation health, and human impact along remote trail corridors. The work was exactly the kind of complex field operation I had spent years training for, and the timing was fortuitous. Spending several days in genuine wilderness, miles from roads and cell service, provided both a mental reset and an opportunity to demonstrate leadership capabilities that might lead to future advancement. The team I assembled included 2 other conservation officers, a wildlife biologist from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and a botanist from the Forest Service. We spent 4 days traversing high alpine terrain, documenting grizzly bear sign in areas where the species was thought to be potentially returning after decades of absence, assessing the health of alpine tundra ecosystems, and evaluating whether certain trails were experiencing overuse that might require management intervention. Go during visiting hours when other people are likely to be present, which limits the possibility of being cornered into difficult conversations. Keep the visit brief. If anyone starts pressuring you about Rebecca or about family reconciliation, you are free to leave immediately. Your father's medical crisis does not obligate you to tolerate emotional manipulation, and you can express concern for his health without surrendering the boundaries you have established. I thought about this advice for several hours, working through scenarios and potential outcomes. Finally, I reached a decision that felt aligned with my values, even if it carried risk. I would visit my father once briefly, to confirm that I did not wish him harm despite our conflicts. But I would not allow the visit to become an opportunity for my mother or Rebecca to pressure me into backing down from positions I had taken for sound reasons. If the visit devolved into manipulation or attack, I would leave. But I owed it to myself to at least determine whether my father's request to see me came from genuine desire for reconciliation or from some other motive. The following morning I drove to Denver, arriving at the hospital during mid-morning visiting hours when I calculated the cardiac unit would be busy enough to provide some protection against being trapped in extended confrontations. I checked in at the nurse's station and was directed to my father's room, my heart rate elevated and my palms slightly damp despite my attempts to remain calm and centered. My father's room was a standard hospital setup with medical equipment monitoring his vital signs, and an 4-line running into his arm. He looked diminished in the hospital bed, older and more fragile than I remembered from the last time I had seen him. My mother sat in a chair beside the bed, and her expression when she saw me enter was complex, cycling through surprise, relief, anger, and something that might have been shame before settling into a carefully neutral mask. "Diana," my father said, his voice weaker than normal. "You came. Aunt Maureen said you asked to see me. I wanted to make sure you were all right." My mother stood, her posture defensive. "We have been trying to reach you for days. Where were you that you could not be contacted during a family emergency?" "I was leading a wilderness assessment in an area without cell service. It is part of my job. I came as soon as I received the message." "That job," my mother said, her tone making clear she viewed my career as somehow problematic. Always that job, taking you away from family when you are needed. I felt my jaw tighten but kept my voice level. Mom, I am not going to discuss my career choices right now. I am here because Dad asked to see me. If this visit is going to turn into another round of criticism and manipulation, I will leave. My father raised his hand weakly. Linda, please. I asked Diana here to talk to her, not to fight with her. He turned his attention to me. Diana, I need to say something to you, and I need to say it while I still can. This heart attack was a wake-up call. When I was in the emergency room thinking I might die, I realized I had a lot of regrets. One of the biggest was how I handled the situation with you and Rebecca. My mother made a sound of protest, but my father continued speaking. I enabled your sister's behavior for years. I knew she was taking advantage of your generosity. I knew she was not treating you with the respect you deserved, but it was easier to let it continue than to confront it, because confronting it would have meant dealing with conflict, and your mother's anxiety and Rebecca's drama. So I took the path of least resistance, and I let you absorb the costs of keeping the peace. The admission was so unexpected that I found myself unable to respond immediately. My mother was staring at my father with an expression of betrayal, clearly unhappy with this deviation from the family narrative. Robert, you do not need to say these things. You are not thinking clearly because of the medication. I am thinking more clearly than I have in years, Linda. Our daughter had every right to be angry about what Rebecca did. Rebecca stole her key, invaded her property, and then tried to make Diana look like the villain when she enforced basic boundaries. And what did we do? We sided with Rebecca. We tried to get Diana fired from her job. We spread rumors about her mental health. We behaved abominably, and I need Diana to know that I recognize that now. I sat down heavily in the chair against the wall, trying to process this unexpected turn. Dad, why are you telling me this now? Because I might not get another chance. Because I want you to know that even though I failed you, I am proud of you. You built a career doing meaningful work. You bought that cabin with money you earned and transformed it into something beautiful. You stood up for yourself when your own family was treating you poorly. That takes courage, and I should have celebrated it instead of punishing you for it. My mother stood abruptly. I cannot listen to this. Diana, your father is confused and upset because of the heart attack. He does not mean what he is saying. Rebecca is devastated by what you did. Absolutely devastated. Your refusal to apologize is tearing this family apart. The family was already torn apart, Mom. It has been torn apart for years, we just did not acknowledge it because I kept absorbing the damage to maintain the illusion of unity. I am not going to do that anymore. So you are going to let your father die with this rift between us? You are going to be that selfish? My father's voice, though weak, carried authority. Linda, stop. Diana is not being selfish. She is being healthy. And I want her to know that I support her, even if it is years too late. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my mother alternating between anger at my father for breaking ranks and attempts to convince me that family reconciliation required me to apologize and accept blame for conflicts I had not created. I maintained my boundaries, refusing to engage with her manipulation while acknowledging my father's words without committing to any particular course of action. When a nurse came in to check my father's vitals and suggested he needed rest, I used the opportunity to extricate myself from the room. My father called out as I reached the door. Diana, I meant what I said. I am sorry for how I treated you. You deserved better. Thank you for saying that, Dad. I hope you recover fully. But you should know that words are just the beginning. If you want a real relationship with me going forward, it will require sustained changed behavior, not just a deathbed apology. I walked out of the hospital into bright sunlight, my emotions churning in ways I had not anticipated. My father's apology had been unexpected and, as far as I could tell, genuine. But it had also come only when he faced his own mortality, only when the consequences of his choices became impossible to ignore. The question that would take time to answer was whether his recognition of past failures would translate into actual changed behavior once he recovered, or whether this was simply a momentary clarity that would fade once the immediate crisis passed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.